The first thing I knew of it was the sound a small fist makes on glass. Not a knock. A knock has patience in it, a rhythm, the courtesy of someone who expects a door to open. This was faster than that and softer and worse, the frantic slap of an open palm hitting a pane over and over, muffled by half an inch of old crown glass and the whole width of the winter garden between us. I had heard every sound that great glass house could make in 30 years of keeping it. The groan of the frames when the frost took them. The tick of the flues cooling at night. The patter of rain that could sound on a bad autumn evening like a crowd applauding something no one had done. I knew all of them. I had never heard that one, and my body understood it before my mind did. I was already turning, the pruning knife still open in my hand, before I had put a name to what I was hearing. Then under it, threaded thin through the glass, a child's voice. "Help, help, somebody help." I want to set this down plainly, because in the years since, a great many people have told the story of that afternoon as though they had been standing at my shoulder, and almost none of them were. I am Tobias Wren. I kept the winter garden of the palace at Harrogate, the long house of iron and glass that the late Queen Isolde built along the south wall of the gardens, so that lemons and camellias and her white winter roses could survive the Eldermore cold. I am not a brave man. I am a gardener. What I know about that day, I know because I was inside it, 20 paces too far away and 30 years too old to be the one who mattered, and because the man who did matter was a guardsman named Elias Marsh, who was standing his post at the garden gate and had, thank God, ears as good as mine. Let me put you where I was. It was the second week of the cold season, the sky the flat pewter that comes before the first true frost, and I had spent the morning banking the braziers in the far end of the house, the citrus end, where the tender trees lived, and where the great iron stove and its chain of flue pipes kept the air just barely warm enough to keep the leaves from blackening. The winter garden ran 140 feet along that wall, all glass and white-painted iron, divided down its length by a low brick partition into the working end, where I potted and pruned, and the far pavilion end, a domed room of glass that Queen Isolde had used as a sitting room in her last winters. When she died, the king ordered nothing in it changed. Her chair still stood there. Her roses still climbed the south panes. And her daughter, the little Princess Malin, came to it the way other children run to a nursery. That is the first thing you must understand, because it is the reason a child of 9 was alone at the wrong end of a glass house on the afternoon someone tried to make her death look like an accident. Malin loved the winter garden the way you love the last warm thing a lost person touched. She was 9 years old that autumn, small for it, with her mother's straight dark hair, and a gravity to her that unsettled grown men who expected a princess to giggle. She did not giggle much. She came to the pavilion, and she sat in her mother's chair with her feet not reaching the floor, and she read, or she talked to the roses as though Isolde could hear her through them. And she tended a thing that only I and one other person knew about, a lame garden thrush she had found under the south panes with a wing it could not fold, which she had installed in a wicker cage on the pavilion table, and fed on crumbs and named, with a child's terrible literal honesty, Lucky. She came most afternoons. Everyone in the household knew she came most afternoons. Remember that. It matters more than anything else in this account. That afternoon I had not seen her arrive, because I was at the working end with my back to the partition and my hands in the citrus, and the first I knew that she was in the house at all was the fist on the glass and the thin cry cutting through it. I came round the brick partition at a run, a bad run, a 60-year-old's run, my knee catching, and what I saw stopped me for one whole second that I have never forgiven myself. The pavilion end was full of smoke. Not fire. I want to be exact because the exactness is the whole of it. There was no flame, no roar, no orange light. It was smoke, low and gray and lazy, the fat choking smoke of a flue that has stopped drawing, and it was pooling along the domed ceiling and sinking. And through it I could see the small dark shape of the princess pressed against the far glass panes, both hands flat on the glass, her mouth open, coughing and calling into a garden where the nearest person who could reach her was an old man on the wrong side of a locked door. Because the door was locked, that is the next thing. Between the working end and the pavilion there was a glass-paned door in the brick partition, and I reached it in 4 strides and hauled the handle, and it did not move. It did not rattle loose the way a stuck door rattles. It held, flat and final, the way a bolted door holds. And on the far side, 20 feet beyond it through the thickening gray, the child saw me come and flung herself off the outer wall and ran at the partition door. And I watched her small hands beat against the glass a foot from my own, and I could do nothing but shout her name through it and haul at a handle that would not give. "Malin, Malin, the far door, the garden door. Can you reach the garden door?" She could not. I knew she could not even as I said it. The pavilion's own outer door, the one that led onto the terrace, was 40 feet back through the worst of the smoke, and she was 9 and frightened, and the gray was coming down off the ceiling like weather. She stayed at the partition. She stayed at the glass at me because I was a face she knew, and she put her forehead against the pane and coughed and said the word again, smaller now, help. And I did the only thing left to a man in my position, which was to turn from her and roar, at the top of a voice I did not know I still had, toward the garden gate. Guard, the winter garden, a child guard. I have gone over the arithmetic of the next 40 seconds more times than I can count, and I will give it to you honestly, because the honest version is better than the polished one. Elias Marsh stood the garden gate that season, a guardsman of the household in the red winter tunic and the tall black bearskin, 26 years old, 3 years in the Corps, the sort of young man senior gardeners like me generally regard as decorative. I had passed him 100 times at that gate and had perhaps 6 words from him in a year, because a guardsman on post does not chatter, and I had privately filed him under ornament, along with the gilded railings and the stone urns. I tell you that so you understand that I was wrong, and that I had been wrong for a year, and that the correcting of it took him about the length of time it has taken you to read this sentence. He was through the gate before my second shout finished. I did not see him decide. I have asked him since what he thought in that first instant, and he has never given me a satisfactory answer, because I do not think there was thought in it. I think there was a boy who had heard a child call for help, and a man who had been trained until the two things were the same reflex. He came across the garden at a dead sprint, the bearskin gone I don't know where, and he did not run to the locked partition door where I stood useless, because he could see past me what I in my panic had half forgotten, that the fastest way to a child behind glass is not through the door. It is through the glass. He reached the outer wall of the pavilion at the point where the small dark shape of the princess was pressed against the inside of it, because she had run back to the outer panes when I failed her at the partition, back to the light, back to any face at all, and he did not slow, and he did not hunt for a latch, and he did not call for a key. He had, in the 2 seconds of his crossing, done the one piece of thinking the moment allowed. He had seen that the child was against the glass. He had seen that if he put his fist or his boot through the pane she was leaning on, the glass would come in on her. And so he ran 3 panes down the wall, to a section she was not touching, and there, I saw this. I was 20 feet away with a locked door between us, and I saw the whole of it. He tore off his white gloves, wrapped his right forearm in the heavy red wool of his tunic sleeve, turned his face away, and drove his elbow through the pane. It did not shatter like a dropped glass. Old crown glass in an iron frame comes apart in long, wicked pieces, and it came apart around his arm with a sound like a struck bell breaking, and he did not stop to be careful of himself. He punched out the jagged edges left in the frame with the wrapped arm, fast, 3 blows, clearing a hole the size of a hearth, and the smoke found the new opening and began to pour out of it into the gray afternoon in a long, grateful plume, and through that plume, into the broken pavilion of the late queen, Guardsman Elias Marsh put his shoulders and his head and went. "Turn your face away from me, little one," I heard him say, not shouting. I have always remembered that he was not shouting. His voice came level and low through the smoke as though he had all the time in the world, which is a thing they must teach them, that a frightened child will do what a calm voice tells her and will not do what a shouting one demands. That's it. Turn away. I'm going to lift you now. Put your arms around my neck and hold on and keep your face in my shoulder. There you are. I have you. And he had her. He came back out through the hole he had made with the Princess Malin wrapped against his chest, and her face buried in the red wool at his shoulder, and his own back bent over her to take the edges of the broken frame on himself. And he staggered 3 steps out onto the frosted grass and went down on one knee with her, out in the clean pewter air, away from the smoke. And I was around the long way by then, out the working-end door and along the terrace, my knee be damned. And I got to them as he was easing her down onto the grass, and folding his big, red-wooled body around her small shaking, one like a wall built between a child and the whole world. She was coughing. She was crying. She was alive, and her eyes were clear, and when I dropped down beside them and said her name, she reached one hand out from inside the guard's arms and took 2 of my fingers and held them. And I have kept old roses alive through frosts that killed everything else in the county, and I have never in my life been as glad of anything as I was of that small hand closing on mine. "The bird," she said. It was the first thing she said. She was 9, and she had just been carried out of a room full of smoke through a hole in a wall, and the first thing she thought of was the lame thrush in the wicker cage. "Lucky, he's still in there. He can't fly." Elias Marsh looked at me over the top of her dark head. His face was gray with smoke, and there was a line of red on his forearm where the wool had not been quite enough, and he had a child clamped to him who did not want to let go, and he looked at me, an old gardener he had exchanged 6 words with in a year, and he said, "Can you get to the cage from the terrace door, Master Wren? Low down. The clean air's low down." I could. The terrace door of the pavilion was not bolted. Only the inner partition door had been, a fact that was already, even in that first minute, beginning to trouble the back of my mind the way a wrong note troubles a musician. And I went in low with my coat over my mouth, and I brought out the wicker cage with the lame thrush flapping and swearing inside it, and I set it on the grass in front of the princess, and she let go of the guard with one hand to put a finger through the bars. And the bird stopped flapping and pressed itself against her finger, and she stopped crying. That is the rescue. That is the whole of the part that everyone thinks they know. A child behind glass, a guard who went through it, both of them out on the grass in the cold with a bird in a cage alive. If the story ended there, it would be a good story, and a true one, and I could stop. It does not end there, because I am a man who has spent his life reading the small signs a growing thing gives you before it tells you plainly what is wrong with it. The leaf that curls a day before the rot shows, the bud that will not open, and even kneeling on that frozen grass with my heart going like a hammer. Some old careful part of me had already noticed 3 things, and was already, quietly and coldly, beginning to be afraid of them in a different way than I had been afraid of the smoke. The first was the partition door. It had been bolted. From the working side where I stood, there was no bolt. The bolt was on the pavilion side, the child's side, and it was a bolt no child could have thrown, set high on the frame, stiff. A bolt I oiled twice a year, and had never once seen closed in daylight, because why would anyone lock a little girl into her dead mother's sitting room? The second was the flue. I had banked those braziers myself that morning. I had left the great iron stove drawing clean and steady, its damper open, the smoke going up the chimney the way it had gone up the chimney every cold day for 20 years. A stove that has been drawing clean since morning does not fill a room with smoke of its own accord in the middle of the afternoon. Something had to close the damper. Dampers do not close themselves. And the third thing I did not let myself look at directly, not yet, kneeling there, was that everyone in the household knew the little princess came to the pavilion most afternoons. Everyone knew when. Everyone knew she came alone. I looked up from the bird, and past the guard's bent red shoulders, and up the long slope of the winter garden toward the palace, where already there were figures coming down the terrace steps toward us, servants, and behind them the household guard, and behind them, moving without hurry in a way that even at that distance struck me as wrong for a woman coming to a child in danger, a tall figure in dove gray with her hair dressed for the afternoon. The queen consort was coming down to the winter garden. And Elias Marsh, kneeling on the grass with the rescued child still gripping the collar of his tunic in both fists, felt me go still, and followed my eyes up the hill, and I watched a young man who had just done the bravest thing I had ever seen become, very quietly, very carefully, afraid, not of anything he could see, but of what I could already tell he had begun, like me, to suspect. "Master Wren," he said low, under the noise of the coming crowd, not moving his eyes off the gray figure on the steps. "Who bolted that door?" I did not answer him. I did not have an answer yet. But I have thought in all the years since that the whole of what came after the accusation, and the disgrace, and the long cold fight that nearly broke a good young man before it was done, began in that exact moment, on that frozen grass, with a gardener and a guardsman looking up a hill at a woman walking too slowly toward a child she had every reason to expect would already be past helping. The queen consort's name was Morwenna, and I will try to describe her fairly, because a man telling a story about his enemy owes his listeners the truth and not merely his grievance. She was the king's second wife. The Princess Malin and the young Princes Torin and Bram were the children of his first, Isolde, who had built the winter garden and planted the white roses and died 3 winters before all this, leaving a king half a widower and a household that never quite finished mourning her. Morwenna had come after. She was handsome in the way of a well-kept blade, gracious in public to a degree that made you inspect the graciousness for a seam, and she had 2 grown children of her own by an earlier marriage, Lord Cassius, who was clever and cold, and Lady Verena, who was neither clever nor cold nor much of anything except her mother's shadow. And she had, everyone at Harrogate understood without anyone ever saying it aloud, one steady quiet purpose that ran under all her graciousness like water under ice, to see her own line, and not Isolde's, stand nearest the throne. Malin was Isolde's eldest. Malin of all the children most had her mother's face and her mother's roses and the household's aching residual love. Malin was the one who mattered if you were a woman doing sums about a succession. I did not think all of that, kneeling on the grass. I am not going to pretend I saw the whole shape of it in the first minute. No honest man could. But I had lived at that palace long enough to feel the ice under the water, and when I watched Morwenna come down the terrace steps at a pace no more urgent than she might have used to inspect a border of pansies, some deep gardener's instinct in me, the one that knows a killing frost is coming while the sky is still clear, sat up cold and certain and said, "This was done on purpose, and she knows it was, because she is the only one in this garden who is not surprised." Then the crowd was on us, and there was no more room for thinking. The physician came first, an old sensible man named Dr. Ferris who had brought half the household into the world, and he went to the princess, and Elias gave her up to him with visible reluctance, and Ferris listened to her chest and looked in her eyes and made her cough on purpose, and told me quietly over her head that she had taken a fright and a lungful of foul air and nothing worse, that children were tougher than glass houses, and that a day in a warm bed and she would be chasing that wretched bird around the nursery. I want that on the record early and plainly, because a great deal of ugliness followed, and I will not have it clouding the one fact that matters most. The child was not harmed, frightened past what any child should be, but not harmed. Elias Marsh saw to that, with a wrapped arm through a pane, before harm could be done. The whole of the cruelty that was intended never landed, and the reason it never landed was standing there in a torn tunic with smoke in his hair, being, at that precise moment, thanked by no one at all. Because the first words the queen consort spoke when she reached us were not to the child. She stopped a few feet off, and she looked at the scene, the broken pavilion, the plume of smoke still leaking from the hole in the wall, the child in the doctor's arms, the guardsman on his knee, and her face arranged itself into a mask of horror so swift and so complete that I, who was watching for the seam, saw the seam. And she said, in a voice pitched to carry to every servant on the terrace, "What has been done to my husband's daughter, who has broken the late queen's house? Not what happened, not is she safe, who has broken it, as though the crime in the garden that afternoon were the crime against the glass." "The house filled with smoke, madam," I said before I could stop myself, an old gardener speaking out of turn to a queen consort, which is not done. The flue stopped drawing. The child was trapped. The partition door was bolted from the inside. This guardsman heard her and broke the pane to reach her. He has saved her life. I felt Elias go still beside me. I think he knew, before I did, that I had just made a mistake, that I had said the word bolted out loud, in front of 40 witnesses, before either of us understood the board we were playing on. Morwenna's eyes came to me and rested there a moment, and I will tell you that they were not the eyes of a frightened stepmother. They were the eyes of a woman recalculating. Then they moved to Elias, and to the broken wall, and to the long jagged hole with the smoke still curling from it, and something settled in her, some decision, and when she spoke again her voice had changed. It had gained the particular warm sorrow of a great lady confronting the carelessness of her inferiors. "Bolted from the inside," she repeated gently, as though correcting a confused old man. "Master Wren, the child bolted the door herself in her fright as any child would and could not draw it again. That much is plain. And this soldier," she let the word cool in the air, instead of fetching a key, instead of calling for help, instead of any measured thing a trained man of the household ought to do, chose to smash his way through the wall of a shrine. Look at it." She turned to the terrace, to the gathering servants, to the guardsmen of her own household who had come down at her heels. "Look what he has done to the late queen's garden. My husband ordered that this room be kept exactly as she left it. Not a pane changed, not a chair moved, and this man has put his shoulder through the queen's own window like a common housebreaker." I opened my mouth. Elias' hand closed on my sleeve, not hard, but enough. When I glanced at him, his face was perfectly composed, the guard's face, the one they wear on the gate, and he shook his head at me a fraction of an inch. Say nothing. And I understood too late what he had understood at once, that we were no longer in a garden where a child had been saved. We were in a court, an informal one, held on frozen grass, and the woman who had convened it was very good at courts, and every word I said in heat was a word she would use. "She was behind the glass," Elias said. He said it quietly, to the queen consort, and it was the first thing he had said to anyone but the child since he came through the gate. "The smoke was coming down off the ceiling. A key to the partition door hangs where, madam?" "In the head steward's room, 4 minutes walk up that hill. The terrace door was 40 feet through the worst of the smoke, and she could not reach it. I judged she had less time than a key would take. I still judge it. If I have damaged the late queen's window, I am sorry for the window. I am not sorry that the princess is breathing. It was, I have always thought, exactly the right thing to say and exactly the wrong thing to say, right because it was true and plain, and every servant on that terrace heard the truth in it, and wrong because it was a young guardsman contradicting the queen consort in front of the household, and Morwenna had just been handed, by his own honest mouth, the shape of the thing she meant to build. "You judged," she said softly. "A guardsman on the garden gate judged that he might abandon his post, tear off the king's uniform, and destroy a royal monument on his own authority. You are 26, I think, and you judged." She let that sit. Then, to the men of her household guard, in the voice of someone regretfully doing a necessary thing, "Take his name. He is relieved of the gate until the master of the guard has heard exactly what happened here, and until the king has seen what has been done to his late wife's house. I will not have men who break walls standing at my children's gates. My children's gates, not the king's, not Malin's, hers." And so it was that I knelt on the frost beside a 9-year-old girl who was alive because of one man, and watched that man rise, and set the child's small clutching hands gently off his collar, and stand to attention in a torn tunic with blood drying on his forearm, and be led away up the hill under a kind of guard, having, as the whole household would be told by nightfall, disgraced himself. He went without a word. He did not look back at me. But as they took him past the broken wall, he stopped, just for a second, in front of the hole he had made, and he looked at the high bolt on the partition door, the bolt on the pavilion side, the child's side, set well above where any 9-year-old could reach. And then he looked at me, one look, level and gray and certain, and I knew that he had seen the bolt too, and had understood exactly what I had understood, and had decided in his silence to say nothing of it to a soul until he understood who had thrown it. They took him up the hill. The queen consort gathered the household's attention to herself and the broken shrine and the tragedy of careless soldiers, and in all the noise of it not one person but me went to the Princess Malin and asked her what had happened before the smoke. So I asked her, quietly kneeling while the doctor readied to carry her up. I said, "Little one, when you came to the pavilion this afternoon, was the door open?" And she looked at me with Isolde's grave dark eyes, and she said, "The garden door was open. Someone had opened it for me. There was a fire lit in the little grate, the pretty one, not the big stove, and a note on Mama's chair that said to wait, that you were bringing the new roses. So I waited. And then the door in the wall shut by itself, hard, and I heard the bolt. And then the room started to smell wrong, and I went to open the wall door and the bolt was too high. And then her voice wobbled, and she gripped my fingers and finished it. And then I couldn't breathe right, and nobody came, and nobody came. And then the soldier came through the wall. A note on the chair, in my hand supposedly, telling her to wait, telling her to stay. A fire lit in the little ornamental grate that I never lit and had not lit that morning. A fire whose small draught, I would work out later, was exactly enough to spoil the draw of the great stove once the main chimney damper was closed. And a bolt thrown high on the far side of a door, from the pavilion, where only someone who had gone in after her, or slipped in and out ahead of her, could have reached it. I did not have the whole of it yet, but I had enough, kneeling there, to feel the killing frost close over the garden in good earnest. Someone had lured a 9-year-old girl into a glass room with a forged note in my name, lit a fire to foul the air, closed the damper, and bolted her in. And that someone had counted on one thing above all others, that no one would reach her in time. That it would be found hours later as a terrible accident, a child, a cold day, a stove gone wrong in an old glass house, a note misremembered. A lock a frightened girl had thrown herself and could not undraw. They had counted on no one reaching her in time. They had not counted on Elia's marsh. They carried the princess up to the palace and the doctor with her, and the crowd went after, and by the time the last of them had gone I was alone in the ruined pavilion with the smoke thinning and the cold coming in through the hole in the wall, and I did what a gardener does when the world has fallen apart. I began, slowly and stupidly, to tidy. I picked up the wicker cage. I righted the little chair. And when I came to the great iron stove, I crouched down in front of it and I looked at the chimney damper, and I found that it was closed. The iron plate turned full across the throat of the flue, jammed, so the smoke had nowhere to go but out into the room. I had left it open at dawn. I would have staked my life I left it open. And beside the stove, in the ash of the little ornamental grate that I never used, the small fire someone had lit that afternoon had burned itself down to nothing, having done its work of spoiling the air, and there was no sign of who had lit it. I reached to draw the damper open, and then I stopped, with my hand an inch from the iron, because some cold, clever instinct told me not to touch it, told me to leave it exactly as it was. A closed damper in a stove I had left open was not a mess to tidy. It was a witness. And in a household where the queen consort had already, within 10 minutes, begun to build the story that this was an accident and a careless soldier, A witness might be the only friend an honest man had. So I left the damper closed, and I left the ash of the little fire, and I went and found the head steward, and I told him, carefully, plainly, in front of 2 footmen so there would be others who heard it, that the stove damper was closed and I had left it open, and that the pavilion should be locked and no one permitted to touch the stove until the king's own people had seen it. He was a decent, frightened man, the head steward, and he did as I asked, and it is because of that hour and those 2 footmen and a gardener's stubbornness about witnesses that any of what followed could be proved at all. Then I went up to the palace to find out what they were doing to Elias Marsh. What they were doing, I learned, was building a very tidy little coffin for his career, and for mine besides. By that first evening the household had a story, and the story was Morwenna's, and it went like this. The little princess, in her grief for her mother, had been permitted to run wild in the late queen's shrine, unsupervised against all good sense, and here a soft reproach glanced off the king, who had allowed it, and off the dead queen, who had built the dangerous glass folly in the first place. On this particular afternoon, the old stove in that folly had gone wrong, as old stoves in ill-kept glass houses will, and filled the room with smoke. The princess, frightened, had bolted the inner door herself and been unable to open it. A tragedy had been very narrowly averted. And it had been averted not by any credit to the household, but in spite of it, by a young guardsman who, whatever the eventual good fortune of the outcome, had abandoned his post, removed the king's uniform, taken the law of the household into his own hands, and destroyed an irreplaceable royal monument, all on his own 26-year-old judgment. A brave impulse, the story allowed graciously. But a soldier is not paid for impulses. A soldier is paid for discipline. And a household that excused a man breaking walls today would find him breaking heads tomorrow. It was a good story. I hated it with my whole heart, and I could see even so how good it was, because it took every true thing, the smoke, the broken glass, the guard's own honest admission that he had judged, and set them at a small clever angle, and by that angle turned a rescue into a disgrace. And it did one thing more, one thing so quiet that I did not feel the full cold of it until I was lying awake that night. It accounted, in advance, for the bolt and the damper. The child bolted the door herself. The old stove went wrong. There was no crime, there was only carelessness, the late queen's and the king's and a gardener's, and a soldier who had made a bad situation dramatic. If anyone were to come forward now and say the damper was deliberately closed, the bolt deliberately thrown, they would be met with a story already standing, already believed, already comfortable, in which such a person was merely trying to make excuses for the negligence that had nearly killed a child on their watch, and whose negligence in that story had nearly killed the child. The gardener's, mine, the man who kept the stove, the man who, it was gently established over the following 2 days, by people who never quite said it to my face, had grown old and careless, had let the flues foul, had perhaps, poor devoted old fool, loved the late queen's garden a little too much and kept it a little too much as a private shrine, and a little too little as a safe place for a living child. And there was a note, was there not? A note found half burned in the little grate, in a hand that resembled, the steward was so sorry, old Wren's own, telling the princess to wait alone in a cold glass house for roses that were never coming. That was when I understood that I was not a witness in this thing. I was to be the accused. I want to be honest about how that felt, because it is part of the story of what Elias Marsh was, and you cannot measure the man without it. For about a day and a night I was afraid in a way I had not been since I was young, not the clean sharp fear of the smoke, but a slow sick dread, the dread of an ordinary man who suddenly sees the machinery of a great household turning to grind him small, and knows he has no rank, no family, no friend near the throne, nothing but 30 years of honest work that could be made, by a clever enough tongue, to look like the 30-year incubation of a fatal carelessness. I thought about the forged note in my hand. I thought about how easily a jury of my betters would believe that a lonely old gardener who talked to roses had written it. And I will confess to you that on that first night I thought, God forgive me, about saying nothing, about letting it be an accident, letting the guard take his discipline and myself take my quiet retirement, because the alternative was to stand up in front of the queen consort of Eldermore and call her, in so many words, a woman who had tried to murder a child. I am not proud of that night. I tell you about it so that you understand what it cost later to do otherwise, and so that you understand that the reason I did otherwise had a name, and the name was Elias. They held him in the guardhouse, not a cell. They were careful about that, only confined to quarters pending the master of the guard's inquiry. And on the second day I bribed my way in to see him with a basket of the late queen's forced pears, which is the only currency an old gardener has. I found him sitting on the edge of his cot with his forearm bound where the glass had cut it, and I sat down on the one stool, and for a while neither of us said anything, two men from opposite ends of a household with nothing in common but a locked door and a child. Then I told him all of it, the closed damper, the note in my hand, the story that was being built. The fact that I was to be its villain, the careless old gardener, and he its foolish young accomplice, and that between us we would carry off the blame for an accident that had never been an accident at all, and that the woman who had arranged the whole of it was at that moment sitting by the king's side, grieving beautifully for her stepdaughter's fright and her late rival's ruined garden. He listened to all of it without moving. When I had finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at his bound arm, and then he said a thing I have never forgotten, in that same level voice he had used through the smoke. Master Wren, when I came through that gate, I did not stop to reckon what it would cost me. If I had stopped to reckon, the reckoning would have taken longer than the child had. He looked up. I am not going to start reckoning now. They will break you, I said. You are 26 and you have no one. They will make you the reckless boy who wrecked the queen's shrine, and if you say one word about the bolt, they will make you the reckless boy who wrecked the queen's shrine and then tried to slander the queen consort to save his own skin. And they will make me the old fool who wrote the note. Elias. There is a version of this where we both simply bow our heads and go, and the child is alive and it ends. No, he said, there isn't. Why not? Because it isn't over for her. He said it very simply. Master Wren, someone lit that fire and closed that damper and bolted that door, and they did it because the child is in someone's way. She was in the way this morning. She will be in the way next month and next year. If it is called an accident, then whoever did it learns that it works, that a child can be shut in a glass house on a cold afternoon, and no one will ever ask the right question. And the only thing that goes wrong is that once, by luck, a guardsman happened to have good ears. They will not leave it to luck twice. He turned his gray eyes on me. I did not break that window to keep her alive for an afternoon. If we let this be an accident, we have not saved her. We have only postponed her. And I would rather be broken telling the truth than stand at that gate for another 30 years knowing. I let them practice on a child until they got it right. I have kept roses through hard frosts. I have never in my life been so ashamed of myself, or so glad to be shamed, as I was on that stool in the guardhouse listening to a boy half my age tell an old man what courage was. Then what do? I said, against the queen consort of Eldermore. And Elias Marsh, confined to quarters and disgraced and bleeding through a bandage, smiled, the first time I had seen it, and said, We do what soldiers and gardeners are good at, Master Wren. We are patient, and we tend the truth, and we wait for the king. The king, as it happened, had been away. That was the piece of luck we did not deserve and would not have survived without. King Alaric had been 3 days' ride to the north, at the old hunting seat, settling a matter of tenancy that had gone sour, and he did not return to Harrogate until the 4th day after the fire. That meant that for 3 days the story of the careless soldier and the ruined shrine had grown and set and hardened in his absence, tended by Morwenna, so that by the time he rode into his own courtyard the whole household knew the tale and half of them believed it. But it also meant that the king had not been present to feel the tale being built, and a story you are handed whole, after the fact, sits differently in a wise man than a story you watched grow. Alaric was not a fool. He was a grieving man who had married a clever woman out of loneliness, and had not yet let himself count the cost of it, which is a different thing from a fool, and a more dangerous thing for Morwenna, because a fool cannot be woken, and a lonely man can. I did not know any of that yet. What I knew in those 3 days was that I had 3 days, and that I meant to use them tending the truth the way Elias had said, and that I could not do it alone. I found my allies in 2 unlikely places, and I will tell you about them because the story is theirs as much as ours. The first was a boy. Prince Torin was 11 that autumn, Malin's elder brother, Isolde's son, a serious square-shouldered child who worshipped the household guard with the fierce, uncomplicated love that 11-year-old boys keep for men in uniform. He had been beside himself since the fire, first with terror for his sister. Then, when he learned what was being said, with a white shaking fury that the man who had saved her was being punished for it. Torin came to me in the potting shed on the second evening, having slipped his tutor, and he stood in the doorway with his fists balled, and he said, "They're lying about Guardsman Marsh. I know they are. Tell me how to prove it and I'll do anything." And I looked at this furious, loyal boy and I thought, he can go where I cannot. He can walk into rooms an old gardener would be turned out of. He is a prince, and no one watches a grieving child, and he loves the truth because he loves the man. So I gave the boy a task, and I gave it to him carefully, because I would not use a child as I was being used against. I would not put him in front of the danger. I told him only this, that somewhere in the household was a person who had lit a small fire in the pavilion's ornamental grate that afternoon, and carried it the coals to do it, and that such a person leaves traces, an errand remembered, a scuttle moved, a servant who saw another servant somewhere they had no business being. Ask, I told him, gently as a boy asks, who was near the winter garden that afternoon, who carried coals down. And come tell me, and do nothing else, and above all say nothing to your stepmother or her people about any of it. The second ally I did not find, she found me. On the 3rd morning I was in the ruined pavilion. The king's people had by then sealed the stove, and the doctor had been and gone, and the household had lost interest in the place, when a shadow fell across the broken threshold, and I turned to find the Princess Adela standing in it. Adela was the king's sister. She was a spare, upright, iron-gray woman of near 60 who had never married, had spent her life in the quiet service of the crown's honor rather than its comfort, and was regarded by the whole household with a respect that shaded, in the case of Morwenna's people, into something closer to dread. She missed nothing. She forgave little, and she had loved the late Queen Isolde like a sister, which was the thing Morwenna had never managed to make her forget. She came into the pavilion and she looked at the hole in the wall and the sealed stove and the empty chair, and she said, without any greeting, "They tell me you left this stove open, Wren, and let it foul, and nearly killed my niece with your carelessness." "They do tell it that way, Highness," I said. "And is it true?" I looked at her. I had one chance, I understood, and it hung on how I answered a direct question from the one person in that palace who could not be lied to and could not be bought. So I told her the truth, all of it plainly, the way I had told Elias, the open damper I had left, the closed damper I had found, the fire in the grate I had never lit, the note in my hand I had never written, the bolt above a child's reach on the far side of the door, and the fact which I had not dared say aloud to anyone else, that everyone in the household knew the little princess came to that pavilion alone most afternoons, at that hour, and that a thing which needed the child to be alone, and unmissed, had been built around that knowledge like a trap built around a game trail. Adela listened to all of it without her face changing once. When I finished she was silent for a while, looking at the sealed stove. Then she said, "You understand what you are saying. You are saying someone in this house tried to murder Isolde's daughter and dress it as an accident." "I am saying what I found, Highness. What it means is above a gardener." "No," she said. "It is exactly at the height of a gardener, which is the one height in this palace no one thinks to watch." She turned and fixed me with a pale, unblinking eye. "I will tell you something, Wren, and then I will help you, because Isolde was the nearest thing to a friend I had in 40 years at this court, and I have watched that woman my brother married move Isolde's children about this house like furniture she means to sell. I do not have proof. Suspicion is not proof. I have taught myself that at bitter cost. But you may have the beginnings of proof in that stove and that bolt and that note, and I have something you do not have, which is the standing to make my brother look at it. Keep the stove sealed. Keep the note. Find me the hand that lit that fire, and when the king comes home, do not go to him. Come to me and I will take you to him, because if you go to Alaric alone with an accusation against his wife, you will be gone from this house by nightfall, and rightly, and the truth with you." So that was where matters stood on the 4th day, when King Alaric rode home. A gardener, a confined guardsman, a furious boy, and an iron old princess, tending a small fragile truth against a beautiful established lie, and racing, though we did not yet know how short the race was, against the master of the guard's inquiry, which Morwenna had contrived to have convened for that very afternoon, the afternoon of the king's return, so that the verdict on Elia's marsh might be laid before Alaric's tired homecoming feet already reached, already reasonable, already done. The inquiry was the false dawn, and I will tell it quickly, because it was very nearly the end of us. It was held in the long gallery before the master of the guard, a decent unimaginative career soldier named Colonel Aldous Vane, who wanted only for the thing to be orderly and did not much care which way orderly fell, and it was attended by the household, and it was steered from a chair to one side that she was not entitled to occupy in an inquiry of the guard, but occupied anyway by force of being the queen consort, by Morwenna. Elias was brought in under escort. The facts were recited. He had left his post, he admitted it. He had removed a portion of his uniform, he admitted it. He had, by his own hand and on his own judgment, destroyed a pane of the late Queen's memorial pavilion. He admitted it. Each admission, in his level, honest voice, landed in that gallery like a nail going into a board, and I watched Morwenna's people nod gravely at each one, and I understood the trap of it completely now. That his very honesty, the thing that made him worth 10 of them, was the rope they were hanging him with, because a liar would have wriggled and been caught wriggling, and an honest man simply told them the truth and let them sharpen it into a blade. "You do not dispute," said Colonel Vane, "any of the acts charged?" "I dispute none of them, sir," said Elias. "Then have you anything to say in mitigation, before the master of the guard considers his finding?" And this was the moment. This was where he could have said it, the bolt, the damper, the note, the whole shape of the thing. I saw him draw breath. I saw Morwenna in her chair go very slightly still, the stillness of a cat that has heard a board creak, ready, I understood later, with a dozen answers, ready to turn any accusation into the flailing of a disgraced boy slandering his betters to save himself, ready to have him not merely dismissed but ruined, and me with him in the same hour. She wanted him to say it. She had built the whole inquiry as a stage for him to say it on, so that she could destroy the truth here, in the open, with the king not yet home, and leave nothing of it standing for Alaric to find. And Elias Marsh, who had good ears and a soldier's patience and a gardener's word in his memory, wait for the king, looked at the colonel, and looked once, very briefly, at the empty great chair at the gallery's head, where the king was not yet sitting, and said, "Nothing in mitigation, sir, only this. I ask that the master of the guard's finding be reserved and not entered until the king himself has heard the matter and seen the pavilion with his own eyes. I broke the king's window. I will answer to the king for it. I ask only that I answer to him, and not before him." It was perfectly correct. It was in fact unimpeachable, a guardsman asking to be judged by his sovereign rather than in his sovereign's absence, the most disciplined and honorable request a soldier could make. Colonel Vane, who loved order, found it entirely orderly. And Morwenna, who had built a stage for a slander that never came, could not object to a soldier's humble wish to be judged by the king without appearing to fear the king's judgment herself. I watched her understand that she had been outweighted. I watched it cost her nothing on her face and everything behind it. And I watched her decide in that same moment that if she could not have him ruined that afternoon, she would simply have to make certain the king never came to the pavilion at all, and that the little truth we had tended for 4 days had, at most, 1 more day to live. The king came home at dusk, and that night, while the household slept, someone went down to the sealed winter garden in the dark to open the stove, and undo the damper and burn the note, and make the last of our witnesses disappear before the king could ever be brought to see it. They had not counted again on Elias Marsh, nor this time on an 11-year-old boy who could not sleep. Here is what happened in the dark, pieced together afterward from 3 tellings, the boy's, the guard's, and the man's who was caught, and I have said it in the order it truly fell, not the order the household first believed. Prince Torin had spent the 4th day doing exactly as I had asked and nothing more, moving through the household with a grieving boy's freedom, asking his gentle questions. Who was near the winter garden that afternoon, who carried coals down, and by evening he had a name. It was not a grand name. It was the name of an understeward of the household called Corwin Halbeck, a soft-spoken, careful man of about 40, who kept the plate inventories and the linen counts, and was known for owing money he was too proud to be seen owing. A scullery girl had seen Halbeck carry a covered scuttle down toward the winter garden terrace on the afternoon of the fire, at an hour he had no reason to be there, and had thought nothing of it because understewards go everywhere. Torin thought a great deal of it, and being 11 and loyal and frightened for the guard, he did the one thing I had told him not to do. He did not come straight to me. He decided to watch Halbeck himself. Which is how the prince came to be crouched behind the stone urns at the top of the terrace steps, in his nightshirt and a stolen footman's cloak, well past midnight on the night the king came home, when a shielded lantern came bobbing down from the palace and resolved, as it passed him, into the careful soft-footed shape of Corwin Halbeck, carrying a small covered pail and a bundle of kindling, on his way to the sealed pavilion to undo everything. Torin did not confront him. Give the boy that, under all his fury, he had the sense his stepmother lacked, and he understood that a man creeping to a sealed crime scene at midnight was not a man to be reasoned with by a child in a nightshirt. So he did the other thing. He turned and ran, silent on bare feet up the frozen grass, not to the palace, which was too far and full of Morwenna's people, but to the one place close by where he knew a friend was kept, the guardhouse, where Elias Marsh lay confined to quarters, awake, as he had been most nights, listening to the palace settle. Elias heard the boy before the boy reached the door good ears again, and he was up and at the barred window when Torin arrived breathless against it, and the prince gasped out the whole of it in 6 sentences. Halbeck, the lantern, the pail, the sealed pavilion now, this minute. And Elias Marsh, who was confined to quarters under the order of the master of the guard, and who knew with perfect clarity that to break that confinement was to hand Morwenna the final proof of the reckless boy who could not keep discipline, stood at that window for exactly as long as it took to weigh it. And then he told the prince to run for the king's sister, Princess Adela, and no one else, and wake her and bring her, and he put his shoulder to the door of his own confinement and broke it, and went down the hill in the dark after Halbeck alone. He did not go to stop him. That is the fine point of it, the point that a lesser man would have missed, and that saved everything. If Elias had merely charged into the pavilion and seized Halbeck, it would have been his word, a disgraced confined guard's word, against an understeward's in the dark, with the evidence exactly as disputed as before. Elias understood that, so he did not charge in. He came down the outside of the glass, silent along the wall in the shadow of the hedges, to the very hole he himself had made 4 days before, and he stood outside it in the dark and he watched, and he let Corwin Halbeck do the thing he had come to do, in the lantern light, in full view, witnessed. He watched Halbeck set down his lantern, and break the king's seal on the pavilion door and go in. He watched him crouch at the great stove and draw the damper open, undoing the closed damper, the one true witness that the stove had been deliberately stopped. He watched him take from his pail a fresh handful of ash and spill it in the ornamental grate to muddle the traces of the fire he had lit before. And he watched him take a folded paper from inside his coat. A second forgery, I have always believed, a fresh one, since the first half-burned note had been taken into keeping and Halbeck could not reach it, and make to lay it in the grate to be found, a new false note in my hand, to be discovered by the king's men in the morning as the last proof of the careless gardener's guilt. And that was the moment Elias Marsh came through the hole in the wall for the second time in 4 days. He did not shout. Halbeck told it afterward when he told everything, that the worst of it was that the guard did not shout, that he simply stepped through the broken pane into the lantern light, in his shirt with the bandage on his arm, and stood there between the understeward and the door, and said, in that same level voice, "Put the paper down, Master Halbeck. You will want your hands empty for what comes next." Halbeck ran. There was nowhere to run to, but a frightened guilty man does not reckon, and he bolted for the terrace door with the false note still in his fist, and Elias took him at the threshold. Not a blow, not anything the household could later call a reckless soldier's violence, only a hand closed on the man's collar, and a boot behind his ankle, and Halbeck down on the pavilion tiles with the guard's knee in the small of his back, and the guard's quiet voice in his ear saying, "The paper, do not let go of it. Whatever you do, do not let go of it, because that paper is the one thing in this world that can still save you." Which was true, and Halbeck, being a clerk and not a soldier, understood truth when it was explained to him with a knee in his back. He kept hold of the paper. And that was how Princess Adela, coming down the frozen grass in a fur cloak over her nightgown with Prince Torin at her side, and 2 of her own household men behind her carrying torches, found them. An understeward face down on the tiles of the late Queen's pavilion, a fresh forged note gripped in his fist, the king's broken seal on the door beside him, the stove damper freshly hauled open, and a disgraced guardsman kneeling over the whole of it, keeping it exactly as it was, so that it might be witnessed by someone who could not be dismissed. "Well, Wren," Princess Adela said to me, for I had come to, roused by a footman Torin had sent, arriving just behind her, surveying the lantern-lit scene with her pale, unblinking eye. "It seems your careless stove has learned to open its own damper in the middle of the night, and a note in your hand has learned to write itself while you sleep in your bed with 2 footmen to swear you never left it." She looked down at Corwin Halbeck, who had begun, quietly, to weep. "Get up, Master Halbeck. You are going to have a conversation with my brother the king, and you are going to have it now, while it is still dark, and you are going to decide in the next few steps up that hill whether you climb them as a witness, or as the only man in this house who hangs for a thing he was paid to do by someone who is at this moment asleep in a warm bed, and means you to carry the whole of it alone. I have never heard a threat, and a mercy folded so neatly into one sentence. It was the most princessly thing I ever witnessed, and it broke Corwin Halbeck open like a dropped pot. He told it climbing the hill, and he told it again in the king's private study an hour before dawn, and he told it a 3rd time later before witnesses who wrote it down, and it never changed, which is how you know a confession is true. He was in debt deep and quietly, the kind of debt a proud man hides until it owns him. And some months before, a person in the Queen Consort's service, not Morwenna herself, never Morwenna's own hand or mouth, she was far too careful for that, but her son, Lord Cassius, speaking as sons speak for careful mothers, had found the shape of Halbeck's debt and bought it. And then, gently over weeks bought Halbeck. Nothing so crude as murder at the first, small things, which door was watched, when the child was alone, what the gardener's hand looked like on a requisition. And then when the small things had made him theirs, the afternoon itself. The note in my hand, the fire in the grate, the damper closed, the bolt thrown high on the pavilion side, and Halbeck's own instruction, which he swore to on his life, which he wept as he swore, that it was to look like an accident, that he had been told, been promised, that the child would be found in time, that it was only to frighten, only to make the king see the glass house was dangerous and close it, and move the children away from Isolde's shadow and Isolde's memory, and Isolde's dangerous senior-born daughter. He had believed that, Halbeck said, or he had made himself believe it, because a man in debt will believe anything that lets him keep breathing. But he had stood on the terrace that afternoon after he bolted the door, and he had heard the child begin to cough behind the glass, and he had heard her call out, and no one had come, and no one had come, and he had understood too late, coward that he was, standing frozen on the terrace, unable to go back and unable to walk away, that whatever he had been promised, the thing that had actually been built was a room a child could not get out of, filling with smoke, with no one coming. And he had been standing there, he said, in the worst minute of his life, when a guardsman came across the garden at a dead run and put his elbow through the wall, and Corwin Halbeck had turned and fled up the hill and been sick in the shrubbery, and thanked to God he did not deserve to speak to, that the boy had had good ears. The king listened to all of it in silence, in the gray hour before dawn, in his study, still in his traveling clothes, having been woken by his sister with the words. She told me later exactly what she had said, having chosen them on the stairs. Brother, get up. Someone has tried to kill Isolde's daughter, and the man you were about to disgrace for it is the only reason she is alive to be tucked in her bed tonight. Come and hear it before your wife wakes. I was in that study. I want to tell it exactly, because I have heard a dozen embroidered versions since, and none of them is as terrible as the plain one. King Alaric was not a young man, and grief had not been kind to him, and the woman he had married in his loneliness had spent 3 years teaching him gently not to look too hard at anything that would disturb his peace. So I watched a man be forced, in the space of an hour before dawn, to look. He heard Halbeck. He heard Adela. He heard me, the careless gardener, lay out the open damper and the closed damper, and the note in my hand I never wrote. And he sent a man down to the pavilion to bring back the sealed stove's evidence and the first half-burned note, and he set the 2 notes side by side on his desk. The one meant to hang me, and the fresh one Halbeck had been caught holding, and he saw, as any man would see, that they were written in the same disguised hand, and that the hand was not mine. Because he sent for a true sample of my writing from the garden accounts, and laid that beside them too. And the king of Eldermore sat and looked at 3 pieces of paper for a long time, while the window went from black to gray. And then he sent for Elias Marsh. Elias came in still in his shirt, the bandage on his arm having broken his confinement, and thereby, by the letter of the law he had lived by, disgraced himself a second and final time. He stood to attention in front of his king, this young man, and he waited, and I watched him prepare himself to answer for the broken door of the guardhouse and the broken window of the pavilion and everything else they might yet make of him, and give no excuse, because he did not deal in excuses. King Alaric looked at him for a while, then he said, "You broke your confinement tonight." "I did, your majesty." "On whose authority?" "On no one's, your majesty. There was no time to find an authority. There rarely is." And the king, I saw it, almost smiled, the way a drowning man almost smiles at the rope, and he said, "That is the second wall you have broken through in 4 days, guardsman, and the second time you have been entirely right to break it, and I find I am done being told by clever people that a man who is right should be punished for the manner of it." He rose from his desk. He was not a tall man, the king, but he seemed to gather height as he stood. "You went through a window for my daughter, when the whole trained household stood about deciding whose fault the smoke was. You kept a guilty man and his forged lie exactly as you found them, on the floor of my dead wife's house in the dark, alone, so that I, who was about to sign my name to your ruin, might be shown the truth instead. Colonel Vane's inquiry is dissolved. Its finding is struck, and I will speak to what you are owed shortly, and it will not be a reprimand." He turned to the window, and the gray light was on his tired face, and he said more quietly, in the voice of a man saying a thing he has put off saying for 3 years, "Now send for the queen consort, and send for my son Cassius by marriage, and wake my sister's guard, all of them. I find I want a great many honest witnesses in this room, before I do the thing I am about to do. I will not give you the whole of the confrontation that followed, because some of it was a king's private grief, and not for a gardener to hand about. But I will give you the shape of it, because the shape is the justice, and justice is the thing this story is finally about." Morwenna came in beautifully composed, and she stayed composed for longer than I would have believed possible, through Halbeck's weeping confession and Adela's cold recitation, and the 3 notes on the desk, deflecting, softening, grieving, turning each fact a small clever angle exactly as she had turned them all in the garden 4 days before, until the king, who had let her do it, who had watched her do it with a terrible new attention, said only, "Enough," and it was enough. Because Lord Cassius, brought in cold and clever and certain of his mother's cleverness, had made one error. Confronted with Halbeck, whom he had never expected to be caught, and certain the man would never dare name him, he had looked at Halbeck with contempt instead of confusion, and a man who is truly being slandered looks confused, and a man who is being betrayed by his own instrument looks as Cassius looked. And the king saw it, and the whole room saw it, and Morwenna saw the king see it, and that was the moment her composure finally went, not into rage, but into the still white calculation of a woman with no more moves, doing her sums one final time, and finding them all come to nothing. King Alaric did not shout at his wife. I have thought since that his not shouting was the most frightening thing I ever saw a man do. He simply told her, in a level voice not unlike Elias' own, what would be. Lord Cassius would answer to the law of the realm for the procuring of an attempt on the life of a princess of the blood, not to a household inquiry Morwenna could steer, but to the king's bench in the open, with Halbeck's sworn confession, and the notes, and the stove, and a prince and a princess, and a gardener and a guardsman to witness. Corwin Halbeck, who had confessed freely and whose horror on that terrace had at least been real, would answer too, but as a man who had turned and told the whole truth, which the law weighs, and which the king said plainly he would ask the court to weigh. And Morwenna herself, against whom no hand and no written word could be proved, so careful had she been, so entirely had she worked through her son and her son's creature. Morwenna the king could not send to the king's bench, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and for one moment I saw the old ruinous temptation flicker in him to let that be the end of it, to keep his peace, to look away one last time. He did not look away. He had done enough looking away, I think, to last him the rest of his life. He could not prove her a murderess, so he did not call her one. Instead, he did the thing that was within his power, and within the truth. He told her that he no longer knew her, that a marriage is a trust and she had spent his to the last coin, and that she would leave Harrogate that morning, not fleeing, not disgraced by any charge she could deny, but removed quietly and completely to the dowager house in the far north of the realm, with her household and her income and her title and every outward courtesy, and with an absolute and permanent severance from the children of Isolde, whom she would not see, nor write to, nor come within the walls of, for the remainder of her life. Lady Verena went with her mother. And the king set his sister Princess Adela, whom he trusted as he trusted no one else alive, over the care and the guardianship of Malin and Torin and little Bram, so that never again would Isolde's children sleep in a house governed by the woman who had wished them gone. It was not the justice of a story, where the wicked are struck down in the last act to a roll of drums. It was the justice of a real and careful king, doing the most that truth and law and mercy together would allow, and refusing at last to do any less. Cassius went to the king's bench and was condemned there in the open, and Halbeck with him and more lightly, and the door of the North Dowager house closed on Morwenna, and it did not open again. And that, I have come to believe, is the truer kind of ending, not the lightning bolt, but the door closed forever by a man who has finally decided to see. There remains only to tell you what became of the ones who deserved a better fate than the story had so far given them, because they got it, and a man should not close an honest account on the villain's punishment and forget the good. Elias Marsh was not reprimanded. He was before the assembled household in the long gallery where he had 4 days earlier been all but condemned, commended by the king's own mouth and raised, over the heads of men who had watched him disgraced and said nothing, to sergeant of the household guard, and given the particular and permanent charge, which he holds to this day, of the safety of Isolde's children, a charge he asked for, and the king granted before he could finish asking. I have watched him stand at the nursery gate on 100 ordinary mornings since, immaculate and unremarkable, and I know what the household does not always remember, which is that the man at that gate once went through a wall for the child behind it, and would do it again between one breath and the next and never once call it brave. Prince Torin, who could not sleep and would not leave a friend to the dark, was given by the king a soldier's honor rare for a boy, a plain iron token struck for the guard, which Torin wears yet, and values, I think, above every jewel in his father's house. And the gardener kept his post, and his name, and his 30 years, and was told by the king in private that Eldermore did not forget the men who tended its truth when tending it was dangerous, and went back down to the winter garden with his knee still bad and his heart, for the first time in a week, quiet. We rebuilt the pavilion. The king ordered it, not restored to a shrine this time, but made warm and safe and living. The great cold stove taken out and a proper hearth put in with a chimney that could not be stopped by any hand, the ornamental grate bricked up forever, the high stiff bolt taken off the partition door and thrown in the smith's fire, and the broken pane, this was Malin's own asking, and the king granted it, the broken pane left broken for a month before it was mended, so that the child could see, every day, exactly where the wall had opened to let the world back in. Malin healed, the way the doctor promised, faster than the glass did. The lame thrush, lucky, mended his wing by spring and would not leave the garden even when she opened the cage, which she took, being her mother's daughter, as a kind of answer. She sits in Isolde's chair still, in the warm rebuilt pavilion, and reads, and talks to the white roses that climb the south panes. And when the new sergeant of the guard passes the terrace on his rounds, she looks up every time and lifts one hand flat against the glass, not banging now, not calling, only pressing her palm to the pane the way she did on the worst afternoon of her life. And Elias Marsh stops, every time, and lifts his white glove flat against the glass on his side, a hand's breadth of cold, clear glass between them, and holds it there a moment before he moves on. I have kept that garden for 31 years now. I have seen frost kill things I loved and spring bring back things I had given up, but I have never seen anything in it grow as sure and as green as the trust between that child and that guard, planted on a frozen afternoon in a room full of smoke. In the moment a small fist struck the glass, and a man who was not allowed to move came through the wall to answer it. Glass can be replaced. That was the only thing he ever said in all of it that I think he got wrong, for I have watched that mended pane for years, and the child's hand and the guards on either side of it, and I have come to believe that some glass, once it is broken rightly, is never quite only glass again.